Hello, everyone, and welcome to the midweek program at the J.C. Raulston Arboretum. My name is Blake, and I'm the education assistant here at the Arboretum. And today we are in the fantasy circle because there are some specimen trees here, some Big Honkin Trees here. Probably the biggest, nicest crepe myrtles you've ever seen in your entire life. That is because today we are doing a program on Big Honkin Trees. We've got Greg Paige, our director of horticulture here, who's going to tell you about some of our Big Honkin Trees, show you some samples off of a few of them, and as well as give you some tips on how to garden around Big Honkin Trees. Alrighty, and with the announcements out of the way, I think we can pass things over to Greg, and so he can teach us a little bit about some Big Honkin Trees.
Thank you, Blake. So we like to fly really close to the sun here at the Raulston Arboretum, and I initially thought we were going to do a walk and talk. But this is a good prelude to doing a walk and talk in the not too distant future, because we have a lot of nice big honkin trees here at the Arboretum, and I always have a warm place on my heart for them. They're kind of the fabric and the backbone of gardens. And if you think about the way our urban landscapes develop, they're kind of they're getting harder to find in urban landscapes because we're getting smaller and smaller lots, smaller yards, and you have to come someplace like this to experience them, tying back into the forest therapy walk, which I think is a beautiful thing and encourage folks to find out about. But today, what I want to do is talk about big trees in your landscape. I'll talk about a few that we have here and ones that you're probably going to commonly come across out in your gardens and in most landscapes, just to give you a little bit of a taste of that. But wanted to start off with talking about how to garden and interact with big trees. Trees are the correlation, and the best way to explain this is trees are like people. They go through various stages of their lives. They start out as, maybe an acorn, and from there a little seedling, and go up to being a big mature tree. So all through those development stages of their lives, they're experiencing different things. And just like us, they have different longevity. Some live for a really long time. If you think about oaks, they're a relatively long-lived tree. Some is old to 200, 300 years old. And then you take the opposite end of that spectrum and think about, most common garden cherry trees in your landscape. If you get 20 years out of those, you've done something extra special. And smaller trees can have even shorter lives in the landscape. So tie into that, and to pour a little salt in the wound, our urban landscapes. Poor soil, planting too deep, climate change, over-fertilization, introduce insects, all those things have an effect on trees' lives and trees' health. So what I want to talk about are, I always like to have resources with me, so I'm going to point out a couple of those. This is an old standby. This actually was a textbook of mine when I was in college. Diseases of Shade Trees by Tattar. You can find this pretty much anywhere. We pulled this out of our library, 1978. I wasn't in school that long ago, but this is a pretty good standard. There have been a lot more diseases introduced into our world, but this gives you kind of a good backbone. Another good one is I get asked all too frequently about pruning, and there's a lot of dependency on flowering trees, non-flowering trees, evergreen trees. This is a book that came out, this is the second edition. Somebody that I can call a garden friend, Tony Kirkham from newly retired Kew Gardens, The Pruning of Trees, Shrubs, and Conifers. He's got a new version of this out, but this is a fantastic book, and I encourage you to get it if you have burning questions about pruning. And two that are standard in any diagnostic lab. Most extension offices will have these. The master gardener folks will have these as well. These are the Sinclair and Lewis and the Johnson and Lyons diseases of trees and shrubs. These have been around for a long time. Great pictures, great diagrams. These explain the life stages of diseases as well as insects. And the Johnson Lyons book, Insects That Feed on Trees and Shrubs, another good one. Not something you want to carry around with you. This is a good desk reference, but these have been invaluable for a number of years and are available far and wide. There's lots of resources online. I would encourage you to look at our extension publications. We've got some really, really good ones online. That's much easier and quicker to access. And another one that Mark brought up for me, just on some of the newer trees that are kind of out in the landscape. This is John Grimshaw and Ross Payton. Ross was at CEPS this year as one of our speakers, and John Grimshaw is a longtime friend of the Arboretum, and this is a great book. It just came out, Recent Introductions to Cultivation. So if you are a big tree or a honkin' tree nerd, this is a good book to have as well. So, talking about gardening around trees and thinking about ways that you're going to interact with them. A lot of people that I talk to that have older homes will have big trees in their yard and have all that space underneath and want to plant it with plants. And if you think about this big tree that's behind me, it's got a pretty massive root system under the ground. And that root system is, most of it is in the top 6 to 8 inches of the soil, and it extends out to the drip line of the tree. So just behind where our camera is kind of that area. So all that area underneath here is full of this plant's root system. So anything you do with this soil is ultimately going to impact the tree. So that's something to think about. Kind of the mentality is to come in with a rototiller and till all this soil up to make it loose so that you can plant herbaceous plants, bulbs, and other things. But what that actually is doing is cutting up those nice feeder roots that are in that 6 to 8 inches of soil, and that's going to severely stress this tree out. So from a tree care perspective, a lot of problems that we see with mature trees, something has been done to that plant's root system. So you really want to be careful. You want to be cautious when you're gardening in a situation like that. There's better ways to do that. Cultivating by hand. There's a tool that's been out and developed called an air spade that is commercially available. That's something that tills up the soil but doesn't damage the root system. So I would encourage you to kind of look at those things when you're gardening and working under the soil. Planting and having mulch and soil around a tree. If you look behind me, you see how this tree kind of tapers down to the ground. It doesn't look like a telephone pole going right in. This area is called the root flare, and it's really important not to pile mulch up on top of that area, not to pile soil. So coming in, filling soil in here and planting in that is going to cover those roots. It's going to cover that root flare, and that's going to cause a lot of stress and problems down the road with a mature tree and just kind of things that you want to stay away from. I mentioned pruning and the importance of that. Timing of pruning with a purpose, having kind of goals in mind when you do that. All those things are kind of important and things to think about. So that's just a little bit of flavor on kind of gardening with mature trees and thinking about those things when you're in your own garden. And what I want to do now is kind of highlight some big things. And again, this is kind of a prelude to come out and look at the trees that we have and keep your eyes peeled for us doing a Big Honkin Trees down the road, because we're always looking for topics of those, and we like to do those sorts of things. So I'm going to be completely random and start with some conifers. And what I have here are 2 deciduous conifers. And a deciduous conifer is a conifer that loses its needles. So not to confuse you, there are conifers that will lose their needles, and I have 2 right here. This is Metasequoia, the Dawn Redwood, and we've got a really big one down below the McSwain Center. It's a deciduous conifer that grows relatively quickly, has a really nice kind of buttressed trunk, and these needles that are green now, and if you squint your eyes, you can see they're just starting to turn a little bit, and this one is, and I'll talk about him in a minute, but it gets kind of a rusty brown color, which is really pretty in the fall. And really, really like this tree because it has that fall interest and grows relatively quickly in the landscape. Looking at the Metasequoia in my left hand, in my right hand is a bald cypress. And a lot of times these 2 trees are confused. They're both deciduous conifers. They both lose their needles. the bald cypress right here in my right hand has a little bit finer texture than the metasequoia. That's the easiest way I tell people how to tell them apart. And if you're looking at the trees in the garden, the Dawn redwood has kind of a pointy top, and the bald cypress will be more kind of rounded out. So the bald cypress is really, really common. You're going to see these in a lot of landscapes. It's a native deciduous conifer, and you can see that these needles are already starting to turn. We've had some cool nights. The days are getting shorter. Those are some things that trigger plants to start that change and to let them know that fall is coming on, though you wouldn't know it today because it's actually kind of warm. But these are two of my favorite conifers. They're two that you're going to see in the garden. They're two that get really, really big and have a very majestic presence in the garden, and that's kind of why I chose them. So they have that potential to become really, really big in the garden and the landscape. Just like most plants, there's a bazillion cultivars of these, so any flavor that you like, any size. This is just the straight species. The bald cypress can get anywhere between 60 to 80 to 100 feet tall, and kind of the same for the Dawn redwoods. They're very, very similar, and that's why I wanted to talk about them at the same time. So keeping in the conifer realm for a little bit, North Carolina is the land of the oak and the pine, and there are lots of pine trees in Raleigh, North Carolina. We are lucky to have some really big Pinus tadia, loblolly pine in the Arboretum, and this is a sample off of one of the bigger ones in the gathering lawn. We've got a trio of them, 3 planted together, that are really, really pretty and have a nice corner in the garden. And to kind of tell these apart, the easiest way is the needles are arranged on the stems in fascicles. So that is a fascicle off of this branch, and it's got 3 needles. And loblolly pine is a 3-needle pine. So that kind of narrows it down from a identification standpoint. The main reason I picked this today is because these guys can get really, really big. The ones in our garden are probably 30 to 40 feet tall. We also have some celebrity Pinus tadia that JC selected. They're dwarfs, kind of edging our Japanese garden, and then across the lawn there's a couple more. So things to look for when you come out to visit us are these 3 big guys up in the gathering lawn, and the dwarf ones that are just at the edge of the lath house in the Japanese garden. But a really, really nice pine, very stately, and one that gets really big in our landscapes. Another big one that you're going to encounter here, and I'm coming fresh from a Magnolia Society board meeting, so I've got magnolias on the brain. And this is one of my favorite trees. This is the southern magnolia, and we have a lot of these all scattered throughout the Arboretum. This is just a straight species. You can see here, that's the spent flower, and this is going to turn into the seed pod, and this will turn kind of brown, and the seeds inside, as they kind of mature and develop, will be a really bright red. So very, very pretty. It's an evergreen magnolia. It keeps its leaves all year long. A lot of them will have kind of a fuzzy underside on the leaf, and a lot of these have been selected for that characteristic. Again, there's a half a bazillion, if not more, different cultivars of these, one for any flavor or interest that you have. But one of my favorite trees for the landscape, and one that if you have the space, they can get really, really big. And some of my favorite trees that I've encountered and probably steered me towards horticulture were southern magnolias. Had a lot of these growing up when I was a young fellow and liked to climb up in the branches. But one of my favorites, and one that has potential to get really big in the landscape. Kind of related, but not, is our native tulip poplar. And this is a tree that you're going to see in most landscapes, and it's also a tree that gets relatively big and very distinguished by these flat-topped leaves with the lobes, and they range in size. This was off a branch sucker, so the leaves can be kind of bigger than normal, and it gets the common name tulip popular from the flowers that are formed It's kind of a nice green chalice shaped, and it looks like a tulip. This is in the Magnolia family, so it has kind of those characteristics as well. But these are the spent flowers. These will be the seed pods that will propagate and develop as they fall off and underneath the tree. But you're going to see this in most landscapes, and it has the potential to get really big, and that's why I picked it today. Again, there's cultivars of this that range in size, and we actually have an Asian species here that is also a very nice specimen that's related to this. Keeping in kind of that native plant realm, this is a tree that is both beloved and hated in the landscape. This is our sweet gum, Liquidambar styraciflua. You're going to see these in almost every landscape. They grow along the roadside. It is a native tree. They have the sweet gum balls, the fruit that falls, and you like to step on and pick up. It's actually a really good urban tree because it grows in really tough situations. I like this nice star-shaped leaf. The underside is kind of glossy and can be silver in some instances. This tree is known for its really pretty fall color, reds, oranges, and yellows, kind of all at the same time. But these trees can also get big, kind of in bigger landscapes and in the woodlands and things. There is a cultivar that we have here, and this is off that cultivar. It's in our parking lot right behind us, called Slender Silhouette. It stays nice and narrow. 40 to 50 feet tall, but a really, really good urban tree because it just takes up that vertical plane and doesn't grow out really, really big. But something that you're going to see, something that's pretty common, and something that can get big, kind of left to its own devices. We want to talk about some oaks because, as I mentioned earlier, lots of oaks. Raleigh is the oak city, and this is a branch off two of my favorite trees here at the Arboretum. This is Quercus virginiata. This is live oak, and this is off one of the live oaks right at our pedestrian gate. It's a evergreen oak. It'll keep its leaves, and sometimes they'll fall off as they kind of cycle through, but it stays evergreen most of its life stage. They vary in size. The straight species, the leaves can be big or small. These are kind of broad for a live oak. Usually they're a little bit smaller, but it adds a nice accent to the landscape because it keeps its leaves. You see a lot of these in the coastal plain down through South Carolina. Very, very majestic, and we'll have the Spanish moss hanging in them, but it's a really, really beautiful oak that takes up a really important part of the landscape. And two of my favorites here, when you come to visit, you can't miss them. That's a tree that has suffered a little bit with some of the urban development that we've done, but they're very, we're doing our best to take care of them and keep them healthy and happy. But a really, really good oak. Kind of marginally hardy in our zone here and do a little bit better down south, but a really, really good oak for urban landscapes and can get quite large. There's kind of two divisions of oaks in the oak world. There's red oaks and white oaks. The live oak is in the white oak family. This is a swamp white oak, so it's in the white oak family also. It's another one of my favorites because it's a really good urban tree. They are tolerant of wet, dry soils. They do really, really well in our urban landscapes. I like the shape of the leaf, and white oaks tend to have kind of softer lobes than the red oak family, and white oaks are actually better in urban landscapes than red oaks also. The nice thing I like about the white oak is you typically have a kind of a glossy top to the leaf. Right now they're kind of shaggy looking because it's late in the summer and we're all kind of shaggy at this time of the year. But the underside of the leaf has kind of a nice white glow to it that I really, really like. And when these blow in the wind, it adds a kind of a different dimension to the tree. Pretty good fall color, kind of a burgundy to red, but one of my favorite oaks in the landscape because of those winter, spring, summer, fall interests. And in most landscapes, these guys can get kind of big as well.
Was that one Quercus michosii?
This is Quercus bicolor.
Bicolor,
yep.
Nice.
But Quercus michosii, that's another one in the white oak family. That's one of my favorites also. This one is a bonus. it had some pests on it that I'll talk about in a minute. This is Quercus phellos. This is our willow oak. There's probably more willow oaks in Charlotte and Raleigh, North Carolina than any oak in the state of North Carolina. It's used a lot in the nursery trade. It grows pretty quickly, and it's actually a really good urban tree. It's just kind of overplanted at this stage, but we have two really nice ones behind us towards the gathering lawn, and these are samples off of that. It gets the name willow oak because of the lance-shaped leaves, kind of narrow willow-esque, but no relation to willow, just the common name. See them used a lot in urban landscapes. There's been lots of development of cultivars of these trees, so you see them quite a bit. But there are other oaks that are I think, better choices. Swamp white oak is one. Quercus michoii that Blake mentioned is a really good one. But I don't know if you can see, maybe you can zoom in, but there's an insect pest that feeds on oaks this time of the year, the orange stripe oakworm. And they develop different stages, and they're just about done. It's more an aesthetic pest because they're not going to defoliate the tree. They'll defoliate branches. But as I was snipping this off, this is a late generation of the orange stripe oakworm, and there's quite a few of them. So they're going to do a lot of feeding. And depending on your threshold of tolerance for pests, you can let that go. You can snip off the branch that just has the insect on it. In some cases, you can do treatment, but it's kind of a cyclical pest. It's not going to do a lot of damage to your oak tree. But those guys are young. They're getting a late start to things. This insect has been out for a couple months now, but quite a few of them there. Must have been a late laying of the eggs for them kind of to come out. And one more oak to talk about. This is one in the red oak group. This is Shumard oak. It's actually a good urban oak in the realm of oaks, one of the better red oaks to use for a landscape. And you can see I mentioned that the red oaks kind of tend to have more of a pointed leaf on the tips on the edge. That's a quick, easy way to characterize those from the white oaks. But this is one that we like to recommend as an urban oak. It does really, really well. Mixing them up, not using the same species is a good thing. Good urban tolerance, nice fall color. From a wildlife perspective, they usually have a pretty good acorn set. In the landscape, they'll get about 30 to 40 feet tall and about as wide, a little bit more slower growing than the white oaks, but wanted to show you that difference between kind of the white oak group and the red oak. This one had a little bit of feeding damage from that striped oakworm, but either they fell off or the birds ate them. It didn't do a lot of damage with this. And kind of winding down, just a couple here to end with. This is a deciduous tree. This is Gingo Biloba, the ginkgo tree. And I like this tree because it's a good urban tree, does well in urban landscapes, has really, really beautiful fall color, pretty much typically an electric yellow. It's kind of known to be all colorful at one time and drop its leaves relatively quickly. But I don't know if you can zoom in on that leaf. If you look really close, there's fossilized records of this tree, and the thinking is this was one of the first trees to form leaves. And if you look really closely, you see a lot of lines there. The thinking is that those were pine needles that over time developed to close together to be more productive to produce food. And by doing that, turning into more of a deciduous tree and dropping those leaves to kind of save food as it goes through the seasons. But just a really, really interesting tree. Has a lot of history in Japan, which is another reason that I like it. And it's another one of those trees that there's a flavor for any kind of interest you like. There's dwarf ones, there's narrow ones, there's wide ones. There's some really big specimens at some gardens that I've worked at in the past that are 100 feet tall, that are just absolutely beautiful. I have fond memories of being on a trip to Japan and finding this temple on the side of the road that had one that was over 1,000 years old. Just amazing to think about something living that long and being around for such a long time with just this massive, massive trunk and all the good that trees do by producing and filtering the air and all those things. But a good big honkin' tree. We've got some really nice ones here and one that we like to recommend and talk about. And ending on a kind of an oddity and a favorite note, this is Cinemomanthus wilsonii, probably the biggest one that I know of in North Carolina. It's in the Lauraceae family, so kind of marginally hardy here. And this tree anchors the visitor center right behind us. It's an evergreen. It keeps its leaves all year long, but it's a really, really dense conical tree. It's absolutely beautiful, and it's just not something you're gonna see anywhere. The one behind us is probably 35 feet tall, probably as wide as that. If it weren't for the visitor center, I think it would encompass a much bigger area. So you can see the dark green on the top of the leaf and kind of that chalky white underside that's kind of nice when it blows in the wind and adds that interest. But just a really, really unique tree and kind of speaks to the diversity that you're going to find here at the J.C. Raulston Arboretum. So that's kind of the quick and dirty on Big Honkin Trees. As I mentioned, keep your eyes peeled on the schedule for us doing a Big Honkin Tree tour, and we can look at some of these things kind of on up close and personal.
Awesome. That sounds great. I cannot wait to get that tour scheduled.
Me too.
Because I'll be there because it's my job, but I'd be there even if it wasn't my job. Okay, there were a couple of questions.
Good.
I'd like to start with the most inappropriate question I've ever heard on a program called Big Honkin Trees. Somebody's asking if there are any dwarf cultivars of bald cypress or metasequoia.
That's I wouldn't say that's inappropriate because those are two of my favorites. But the topic, yes, it's off topic, and that never happens here. There are a lot of dwarf cultivars of mostly of bald cypress. There aren't very many of metasequoia. There is a metasequoia dwarf cultivar, and the name escapes me. It's right off of the perennial walk when you go into the Japanese garden. I'll think of it when we go off air, but there aren't as many metasequoias as there are taxodiums. There's one called peeved minaret, and I always tell people to take dwarf with a grain of salt. A mature bald cypress can be 100 feet tall. Peeved minaret is a true dwarf, and we've got one of the biggest ones. I'm looking right at it. It's probably 20 feet tall, but it's dense. And it's small in stature compared to our typical native ones that can get over 100 feet tall and have trunks on them that two of us couldn't put their arms around. There are some really, really beautiful weeping ones that I like. Cascade Falls, and if you go up the Weeping Walk, we've got a really pretty example of that. There's another one called Falling Water that's really, really nice. And there's a couple of other ones that are out there as well. But if that's your jam, you can find a lot of those here. We've got a good conifer collection, and we can kind of steer you in that direction.
Our director, Mark, who is tuning in, was gracious enough to provide us with the cultivar name for that metasequoia, Shearman's Nordlicht.
I knew there was Shearman's who was in there. The Nordlicht doesn't stick in my head for whatever reason. But that's a really, really nice tree. It's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this is an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to this, and I am curious to hear what you have to say. But Marilyn's asking, why do crepe myrtles and some other shrubs and trees have exfoliating bark? What's the evolutionary purpose?
Oh, man, leave it to Marilyn to ask a question that we don't know about. I don't know, but I'm sure there's a reason for that. I'm going to go out on a limb, no pun intended, and say there might be some pest thing associated with that maybe it's harder for pests to establish and get to the trunk of a tree. There's a lot of talk about crepe myrtle bark scale right now, and the bark scale has to be up against the trunk to do the damage. It can't be on the flaky parts and bits. So I think that might have something to do with it. The only other thing I can think of is maybe some sort of sun protection or heat regulation kind of a thing. That is definitely something that I'm gonna look up after this talk and see. But I appreciate her always tuning in and asking really, really great questions.
For sure. We got a couple of specific questions about Cinemomanthus wilsonii, but Mark was gracious enough to give us the answers to those. So somebody asked, what zones does it do and how big does it get? And Mark says that it does zone 7B, and ours is maybe 30 feet tall, but it'll grow to 100 feet in the wild.
There's some really big ones down in Aiken, South Carolina. Bob McCartney of Woodlander's Nursery fame planted them many years ago. That was the first place I ever saw them. And there's some down there that are probably 50, 60 feet tall, maybe taller. And they're much happier down there. It stays a little bit warmer. I had a good friend of mine, NC State alum Rodney Eason, who the first question he asked me when I got here was, what's that cinemonum look like? So I had to run out to the garden and take a picture of it for him, because it's an amazing tree, and one of the first things I remember about my first visit here. Just not something you're going to see anywhere.
All righty. The next question comes from Candace, who, if I'm not mistaken, comes from Charleston. So she's going to be asking specifically about sandy coastal areas with wind and salt, but she's asking about linden trees, Tilia americana. She's asking, how do they do?
I know that tree's used a lot in Georgia. So from a zone perspective, I think it would do okay. I'm not sure about the sandy soil part of that. It's typically a pretty good urban tree. We've got a lot of them here on the Arboretum, but I can't say that I've seen a lot of them down in Charleston from an urban standpoint. I'm not 100% sure. Our native Tilia americana, I'm going to say that probably grows down in that part of the world. That's a much more wider spreading native in that family. But the ones that are used mostly for urban trees, I'm not 100% sure. I think from a zonal perspective, it would be fine. The other thing that I think about in Charleston is, the pH of the soil, any kind of salt from flooding and that sort of stuff. I'm probably going to say it's probably not going to like those kinds of situations.
Okie dokie. Not too sure about this next question, but Luann's asking, how important is a sycamore tree? I have a 2-inch diameter one growing off of the original root and could cut it off now myself, but if I leave it, we'll have to hire a lift eventually. Does it need to stay?
Oh, it sounds like you've got maybe a root sprout that's turned into a tree that's coming off. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on if it's healthy, if you're worried about it being too close to your house, all those sorts of things. It also depends on if it's a sycamore or if it's a London plane tree. Those are two kind of different things. London plane is very prone to diseases here. It gets bacterial leaf scorch, so it's short-lived. If you're unsure, I'm gonna go and say, get somebody to come look at it. If you're worried about the structure of the tree, it's hard to diagnose it without seeing it. But if you're worried about it affecting the shape, it's going to be, and it's something that you can prune out. It's going to be easier to do it now than when it gets too big and you're going to have to get a tree company involved. So hard to say without actually seeing it.
Okay, so Sue is asking, can you tell us about ambrosia beetle, the trees it affects, and will they move from tree to tree?
Ambrosia beetle is a really bad insect that usually affects trees that are in stress. They usually don't attack healthy trees. That being said, there is a ambrosia beetle that does attack healthy trees. It's not that widespread, but the one that most people are familiar with is the one that attacks trees that are under stress. So the best way I explain that is when a tree gets hit by lightning, usually the thing that kills the tree is the ambrosia beetle that comes in and attacks that stressed out tree. They know trees produce pheromones. They know when a tree is under stress. And almost instantly, when something like that happens, they come and start to attack it. It's a really bad pest in nurseries. You think about the stress in a nursery of keeping things watered, the heat, the cold, really bad problem in that type of high stress situation. Our urban landscapes are stressful, so it's a problem. The best way to to keep Ambrosia beetle from being a problem is all those cultural things to keep your tree happy. Make sure they get enough water when it's too hot. Make sure you're not covering up that root flare with mulch. Make sure you're using good mulch, not too deep, so it helps kind of recharge the soil. It helps keep the moisture in the soil. You're reducing compaction in a root zone. All those things will help keep the trees from getting stressed out. Pruning correctly, pruning at the right time of the year. If you prune and you do a really nasty cut and it pulls the bark all the way back to the tree, that's going to cause stress, and that's an avenue for insects and diseases and other things. But the best way to keep Ambrosia beetle from being a problem is to kind of keep those stress factors down. If you know your tree is under stress, then that might be a point in time where you might want to do something a little more drastic and do some kind of systemic insecticide. But that's only something as kind of a last measure that you want to do.
Sure. Okay, this is a good question pertaining to Big Honkin Trees. So we have massive pines on the property that we purchased and will be moving to, but the concrete driveway is heaving badly, breaking up and lifting chunks of concrete 5 to 6 inches above the driveway level. Can the root be treated / cut off, or does the tree need to be removed, or what other options are there?
Those two worlds rarely coexist in a good manner. And right plant, right place is always an issue. Some things are more prone to heaving sidewalks than others. Elms and hackberries are notorious for pushing up sidewalks. Oaks can do that too. There's moisture there, there's protection there. They're going to do that and grow and push up. If you cut the roots, you're reducing how that plant feeds, how it anchors itself. You're going to cause stress that ties Ambrosia beetle back into it. If you can reroute your walkway, that's one thing to do. If you can use a porous substance instead of asphalt or concrete or pavers, that's one thing to think about. One of the things that we're dealing with here is we're having roots push up some of our walking pavers, and we're going to have to deal with that. And one way you deal with that is you can shave the paver down so that you've got a little bit more give, so that's not pushing up. I know that you can do that with asphalt. You can kind of shave some of those things down, but it sounds like it's probably well past that. It's probably actually pushing it up. There's not a good answer to give you, unfortunately. It's kind of a losing battle. The trees were probably there long before the driveway was, and there's no good answer there.
Well, geez, that seems like a pretty somber note to end this program on.
Isn't it?
I'll say I love hackberries. Hackberries are beautiful trees. I think that name is hilarious, and I think their bark is very special.
It's one of my favorites here is the one coming down the walkway.
Oh yeah,
just how it kind of drapes down. But yeah, they're super aggressive. The name reminds me of something that cats do.
Oh yeah,
so
sure.
That's
funny.
What comes to my head. That's something to look up. Is what was the origin of that name?
Okay. Well, I think that is all the time we have for today. So thank you very much, Greg, for pulling together this talk for us and pulling together these trees and teaching us a little something about Big Honkin Trees. And thank you, everybody, for joining us on this program today. We will be back next week. I really got to look these things up before we start. Okay, yes, next week's garden conversations. Greg's going to be sitting down with Shannon Curry. So that's going to be wonderful. So I hope you all will join us next week. We'll see you all then. Y'all take care.